Thank you very, very much for those introductory words from all four of our authors. I've got so many questions I could ask, but I am going to try and focus us on a couple of issues that I think have come up from the presentations. Now, what really struck me actually is that all of the books, the three shortlisted books, all are about a very, the early colonial period of Tasmanian history. Quite remarkable enterprise that certainly wasn't intentional by the judges and myself that we were going to look at the shortlist, but all of the histories that are dealt with in these books occur in those first few decades of the 1800s. And I just wanted to ask the authors to reflect on this particular moment, because I think it is a very particular moment for the future of the colony, for the future of all the inhabitants in what was then Van Diemen's Land. What sort of society was being formed? What forces were at play there? And I think I might just go to Greg first to open, I think, this response to this question. What's happening? Greg.
Well, it depends who you would ask that question to. The officers sitting around the table, smoking and sipping on port would probably think it was a damn fine time. The boys at Point Pure and wouldn't be having a very good time at all. And of course, Tasmanian Aboriginal people were not just fighting for their land, but fighting for their lives. And this is the forces that are at play are forces that we still see in the world today. They're the forces of empire, they're the forces of capital. So this is why I think it's important for people to be given the opportunity to understand the history that we all of us as authors are writing about, because it continues to resonate today with in our lives. And if we are having issues with particular things that are happening, whether it be Black Lives Matter or our response to epidemics. I mean, this wasn't, COVID isn't an unprecedented event. Smallpox had a huge impact on Aboriginal people in New South Wales within months of the arrival of the British. So, all of this resonates, and that's what makes writing about history really important, and that's what makes visual history even more so. Tim, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I guess in terms of that society, one of the things which is really striking, I guess, in terms of the work Greg and I have done, and Benjamin Deutero being the central artist in the book and the exhibition, is that here you have a man who comes out to Tasmania in his late 60s, who in London has been a marginal minor figure. And the nature of colonial society is that although he's been a minor artist, he has exhibited occasionally at the key art institutions in Britain, and in Tasmania he can conceive an extraordinary multimedia project where he will try and render what happened, or his version of what happened, between Aboriginal people and Robinson, and do so in drawings, in the first etchings produced in the colony, in sculpture, and oil paintings of a mega scale. So the Lost National picture, a picture up to 14 feet wide. So there's something about, we present him as a kind of little big man. This little man from the centre of empire who comes to Hobart, who can conceive a really, you know, extraordinary project and then characterise it as the national picture, the title of our book, which itself is such a beguiling kind of phrase at a time when there was no Commonwealth, when there was no Australian nation. And so, you know, that kind of question, what was he thinking about? Was he thinking that what happened in Tasmania and his work was a national picture in the sense of the kind of painting which should be in a national gallery, as does happen with the National Gallery acquiring 2 of his major pictures? Does he think that this is a national picture in the sense of rendering a meeting, the interaction between different nations? Does he think that even though Australia is not yet a nation, this is an event which it clearly was and is of national consequence? So, yeah, in terms of what that society in that period can produce, Dutroux is, I think, a really intriguing and really significant figure.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, the idea of conciliation is in itself a very intriguing idea, and I suppose I'm really struck by all 3 books in various ways are about a violent society, a society that is, well, it's a penal colony. Children are incarcerated. There's a war against Aboriginal people being mounted by the British. And I suppose that all 3 books also pick up on ideas about the British system of law and ideas about justice. I found that quite striking, perhaps most directly, Jacqueline, in your work. But what's happening in terms of law? What does law mean? You know, you talk about in your book about Pedder as a judicial biography, but is law in Tasmania, in the British system, the same as what's happening in London?
That's a very good question, and that's part of what's so interesting about taking a legal history perspective to look at this really formative period, as you say, in Van Diemen's Land, when Pedder arrives in 1824 to establish the Supreme Court. That's part of an experiment in extending some of the kind of civil liberties to British settlers here, who many of them conceive of themselves as of course, free Englishmen who should have the same rights as they would in any other colony or indeed in Britain. And this sort of butts up against the reality that this is a convict colony, which imposes sort of various kinds of constraints on how the law could operate, which bits of it can be applied and which bits of it need to be modified to fit the conditions. One of the things that really struck me about looking at that research is, although we tend to hear the successful story of the reformers who got the constitutional reforms they wanted, got the development, the self-government, actually in this early period, there's still a lot of ambiguity about the status of Aboriginal people under the law, how much the free English settlers can participate in sort of the public sphere through the press or through being involved as jurors. And one of the things I really noticed was how many of these people, the colonisers, are the same people bringing similar ideas throughout different parts of the empire. They don't come from London to Hobart and just stay here. They've worked in the Caribbean, they've worked in India or Canada or British North America. So they're bringing a range of ideas and experiences here that we often don't hear about in traditional kind of nationally focused Australian histories, which tend to look at that sliver of their career and nothing else. But once we start to look out sideways, we see that they're borrowing ideas and practices from other colonies and trying these techniques, but also interpreting what they see through those lenses. And when we come to the law, that particularly I was interested in looking at the criminal law aspect, because that's something that I think has been overlooked a lot in the constitutional history tradition, because we sort of think, well, convicts are in that basket. The Commonwealth of Australia as a modern nation state is in this basket, and we haven't been that interested in the mechanics of how the law deals with crime or Aboriginal people. And so that's what I've tried to look at from the perspective of someone who took a particularly legalistic view of the way the law could operate by looking at the legislation which established his court and his role in the colony.
And of course, Steve, the law meant a different thing for the boys that you write about. And I wondered if you wanted to comment a little bit more on the legal system, but also on Point Pure. Point Pure was seen by some as a great experiment, you know, in a positive way, I think.
Well, it's true. I mean, John West, the historian, you probably know, he described it as an oasis in the whole convict story. But and I guess in a sense, the intent of it, as I alluded to earlier, probably was a bit of an oasis of thinking in some ways, but in theory. But it never was in practice because there was never the resources there to give the kids instruction, supervise them properly. It was barely enough bedding and clothing for them, let alone proper classes in any trade. And I think I've got to remember, I think that the British law generally was written by the middle and upper classes for their own protection primarily. And out of fear of these street kids being the beginnings of potentially some revolution, a la the French Revolution, you know, late 1800s, they had the Gordon riots where the army came in and shot about 300 protesters who were protesting about various economic, social type issues. So British society saw these kids as a threat and had declared war on their form of society, if you like. Hence, it was easy to sort of take the decision that the best thing for them, of course, and the best thing for us is to get them out of the way. But back in the early 1800s, England was still hanging children under 14, even in 1814 at the Old Bailey. One was only 8. And the death sentence for under 16s over there wasn't gotten rid of until 1908. So I don't think we should be totally surprised that the treatment of the boy convicts was particularly harsh. And the background behind that again was that a lot of people in British society, and I guess probably by extension among some of the upper classes of early colonial Tasmania, was that a lot of these families and their kids deserved what they got. They were the undeserving poor. They didn't need charity. It was all their fault because they were delinquent in their attitudes or were alcoholics or didn't care for kids and whatever. And I think, you know, I kind of might finish up on another sort of one of Dickens's observations, and that was that he once said that there's a lot of fictions about the law, but he said perhaps the most humorous one of all is that the law is equal to everybody regardless of the size of their pocket. And therefore, as we know, that the poorer you are, the harder it is to get justice through the judicial system. And the more money you have, the greater your chances you have. So I think there's some of the dynamics that were going on in that period you're talking about.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I know that time is running with us, but I just wanted the panel to just reflect on the importance of history and what it means now, because what I think is happening in all 3 of the books is that there's a bit of a disruption around accepted narratives of this period and the topics that you're writing about. And I just wanted to think about, and I think this has come up in various ways, and this is a bit of a rah-rah for history, actually. How important is it, just briefly, to look at the past? We've talked about past, I think, shows us lessons for now, but I just wonder what particular lessons. I mean, Steve, for you, what did it make you really think about the treatment, for instance, of young people now?
Well, I guess, I mean, thankfully we no longer whip or hang children, so we have learned a little bit over the years, but you still see the same sort of reaction in a way that whenever a minority group, particularly a group that's a little bit different in any community, is seen to be going against the social mores, and whether it's, you know, black African gangs or any ethnic group that's causing some street trouble or whatever, there's the same moral panic and sort of prejudice about them, and all of a sudden the media is jumping up and down, and the politicians have to do something, which usually means more punishment and penalties. And they often do that, as they did with Point Pure, without the right investment of infrastructure of resources to actually do the job of any rehabilitation and retraining and putting them on the so-called right path. And the reality is, in Australia, we still have a lot of people, a lot of children incarcerated, blacks and whites. There's about 600 under 14 incarcerated in Australia as we speak. Unfortunately, a lot of them are Indigenous people. That's roughly 1 in 7 of the whole prison population. So it's clearly something's not going right. And even though, as in Point Pure, where they used solitary confinement and isolation at times for the kids, that's been declared a form of mental torture by various United Nations and international medical authorities, but it still goes on as a standard form of incarceration treatment amongst juveniles today. And I think, as in Point Pure, it's very easy for societies, if they see a problem, perhaps asylum seekers might come to mind, where it's just too easy to say, let's move the problem to someone else, somewhere else to worry about.
Yeah, thank you. Tim, what about your reflections on the past and the present? And I'm thinking you're not just an art historian, you're also a professor of law, as we've been talking a lot about justice and law. What are your thoughts there?
Well, clearly the law looms large in the work which Greg and I did. One of the key images in what we do, the Deutero painting, is sometimes interpreted as a painting around the idea of a treaty, something which is of great contemporary relevance now. And the other key image, the proclamation boards, which Greg and I kind of retitled George Franklin boards, has also often been discussed by both lawyers and non-lawyers, people like Des Manderson and Penny Edmonds, in terms of the rule of law. So, the law, is central to our project, as with the others. But I think the visual, is, and I think Greg will want to talk more about this than me, but, the visual as a really powerful starting point for offering new narratives and understanding of Tasmanian and Australian history, and engaging, I think, audiences very powerfully through the visual, seems to me to be really important. And part of the excitement of doing that is not only the opportunity to reinterpret very familiar images, which include the Deutero painting and the boards, but also to come up with, to rediscover what are effectively unknown images. In the course of our work in the Queen Victoria Museum, we found a painting by an Aboriginal boy, which almost certainly is the oldest surviving oil painting by an Australian Aborigine. Never been characterised, identified in that fashion, never brought to a Tasmanian, let alone a national audience. For the first time, publishing what appears to be the oldest surviving photograph of Tasmanian Aboriginal people. I mean, all our projects, of course, involve different types of exciting discovery, but to they are part of this kind of visual project, and to be able to find them, re-identify them, publish them, I mean, those things, to me, matter enormously.
Thanks. Greg, do you want to continue there? I mean, how does the visual from 100, a time away, and yet it's close, but it is a long time away, how does that make us change our thoughts now?
Well, it can be quite insidious. The visual history, these pictures, these colonial paintings can sneak in under the radar. There's a painting by John Glover that a lot of people know of Mount Wellington, the view from Kangaroo Bay, and there are a group of Aboriginal people gathered on the shoreline. And, this is the picture that most people have of colonial landscapes in Tasmania. When we started working on this project and the research I was doing prior to this, I made a really interesting discovery that, and I don't know whether the slides are coming up and people can see them. Not that one. The picture of Mount Wellington, yeah, is the one that people are familiar with. But if you go to the next slide, this was actually the colonial landscape that painters, mostly employed by government, by the governor, were creating. And what we discovered was that up until Glover, there were no Aboriginal people in Van Diemen's Land landscapes. Even painters who were habitually producing landscapes with Aboriginal people standing in the picturesque fashion in the foreground in New South Wales, when they came to Van Diemen's Land, they didn't produce a single image, even though there were plenty of Aboriginal people around. In fact, and this is the point, there was a war being fought and it was out of control. So there was a visual propaganda happening there. And it's only really through this project and the exhibition project and the creation of this book that we've been able to expose that visual lie, if you like, in colonial history, and ask some key questions about why this was happening.
Yeah, thank you. And Jacqueline, I just wondered if you wanted to just comment briefly about what disrupting the past narrative about PETA and the legal history of early colonial Tasmania. Why does that matter now?
Well, I think it matters because it gives us an opportunity to start really reflecting on what these histories are telling us. We've been encouraged, I think, particularly in a relatively new nation state like Australia, there's a very clear effort to create a national history, and it becomes a very linear story, as if this is an inevitable outcome of the last 200 years. Along the way, lots of things might have gone very differently, and I think if we start to revisit the past and ask slightly different questions, we can see those points where things might have changed or gone a different way, and that, I think, gives us hope that things can change into the future, that we don't necessarily have to pursue the same sort of paths that we have to get us here. And I think part of also what broadening that search for information about our past can help us do is see that other former settler colonies are grappling with a lot of the same issues and finding slightly different solutions that we might be able to try here as we try to deal with social justice issues now, but also how we think about our identity and our past. So I think the past and history writing have a very important role to play in helping us make sense of what's happening now.
Absolutely, I certainly agree with that. And on that note, I'm going to hand this over to questions from the audience. So I'm going to read out the question, and I have one from fellow Judge Reby Taylor, who asks that in addition to conciliation, it is interesting that the ideas and beliefs of humanitarian and Christian evangelical thought also are themes across the books and contrast with the reality of the violence of colonial Van Diemen's Land. How might the authors like to comment on this? Because this is a very interesting tension, I think, in the colonial period, where there starts to be, for instance, a strong anti-slavery movement happening in Britain. There starts to be different ideas about humanity and redemption. How does that sit in what is, as we've mentioned, a very brutal society in various ways?
Can I have a go? Yeah, I mean, I guess the way I think about the imperial venture or colonialism is that, the most powerful impetus is exploitative and destructive, that what drives imperialism is the opportunity to take land and resources and subjugate native peoples. but that isn't the complete story. And so, you know, in terms of the environment, which I also write about, and I wrote about in The Colonial Earth, you know, there is also a kind of how there is environmental concern really from the beginnings of settler Australia. And equally, as Reby has talked about in her comment, you know, there is this powerful humanitarian impulse which arguably drives Diderot and informs his view of Robinson. And Robinson is clearly a, you know, hugely contested figure, but you know, on some views also motivates Governor Arthur and Robinson. So imperialism is not simply exploitative and destructive. It's much more complicated than that, and can also accommodate the humanitarian and environmental concern and so on.
Yeah, I wonder, Steve, if you wanted to reflect on that in relation to the boys at Point Pure. What does humanitarian, that stream, mean for them?
Ultimately, it didn't mean a lot, I guess is the short answer. But I mean, the laws that put them there, away from being banished from their home country and to Point Pure ultimately, you know, were laws seen as both God's law and man's law. I mean, God's law and English law was one and the same to the lawmakers. That there's a bit of the Old Testament, you know, some people are just born evil and nasty type of thought behind some of this, and that some people deserve what they got through their own misdemeanours and misbehaviours. But there was also, I think, a lot of, some of the other authors have talked about, that in those early days in Tasmania, this was about survival, whatever perspective you took, and do what it took to get on and survive. So governors might, like Arthur, might carry a Bible around, but at the end of the day, he was interested in his temporal pursuits as he was he any spiritual ones. That he was after promotion, and that meant doing whatever his bosses back in the Colonial Office wanted, and that was to issue discipline, pure and simple. And Commandant Booth, who was running both Port Arthur and Point Pure, his duty was to George Arthur. And George Arthur's duty was up the food chain to the Colonial Office, and that's the way it went. And they may have had some humanitarian instincts, which a lot of them did, including Booth and some of his offsiders down at Port Arthur, and some of the supervisors of the convicts. But at the end of the day, that was tend to be sacrificed to the altar of whatever it took to get on, survive, hopefully get through it all, and in the case of a lot of the settlers and the governors, to profit as much as possible and then get back home to the home country.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, some of those contradictions, I'm just thinking that tensions that exist in any society, but perhaps exist in particular ways in early colonial Tasmania. Jacqueline, how are they there within the, you know, your study is a biographical study of a man referred to in retrospect as a hanging judge, who is bringing the law there in a very real way, and yet he is devoted to his wife. And how do these contradictions sit from your perspective as a biographer?
I think it points to just how complex these ideas are, and within an individual we can see this really well. There's a growing civilising process in European societies in the 19th century where there is this shift from accepting the kind of barbaric public executions, you know, blood sports, all that kind of stuff that characterised the early modern period, to a much more gentle approach to, you know, child welfare, animal welfare, executions no longer being public sort of carnival activities, that kind of thing. So there's this tension there, and we see it in this one man of Pedder, who literally lives up the road from the court for a long time when he first arrives in Hobart Town, so he can't escape you know, the outcomes of his sentencing. But he's also actually a very sensitive human being, I think, as I read through a lot of the accounts that the press reports of trials refer to him being in tears, barely able to contain his emotion as he sentences people to death, because this is an age where there's still mandatory sentencing. He doesn't have an option a lot of the time. If the jury finds someone guilty of murder or burglary or sexual offences against children, there's the law tells him he has one option, and the community also has pretty strong expectations around punishment. As Steve mentioned, that the eye for an eye kind of retributive approach is still very important. We're just moving gradually in the 1820s and 30s into a much greater focus on deterrence and reform. So those tensions are there within him and within the broader community. I was thinking, as Tim was speaking about the kind of press criticism in the 1820s, for example, of what we'd now probably see politicians calling, in the city elites, latte sipping environmentalists or whoever else have a much more humane approach to what's happening at the frontier versus the people who are on the frontier performing those acts of violence. So even within that community, there's these tensions continuously, which are really hard to reconcile.
Yeah. Look, thank you very much. I would love to keep talking about this, but I am aware, unfortunately, that our time is ticking on and we really can't get to some of the questions that have been put forward. But I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, and I suppose what I'm really hoping for our audience is that our discussion has encouraged you to look at these 3 wonderful books, which are in different ways, but I think quite related ways, picking up on a set of common themes. And I suppose one is always, we've talked about the brutality, the violence, the law, the contradictions, what do that mean? But we do also, I think, see what's coming from these historical studies, continue to have a great relevance today and are important for our way we think about our own society. So I'd like to just say how much I've enjoyed this discussion. Thank all of the authors. Thank you for the work that you've done, and acknowledge the work of and support of the Green family, and particularly the team here at the University of Tasmania in bringing this forum together. We can't clap on Zoom, but I think we can thank the panel in some sort of mental telepathy or nod. But thank you very much. And this evening's forum will be available soon as a video and a podcast via the Island of Ideas website that's now on your screen. You can do that link through. The series continues with the upcoming online public lectures and forums also on your screen, and I encourage you to continue the discussion by registering for these talks. The University of Tasmania is looking forward to continuing the ideas, debate and discussion about many topics from and for Tasmania. So thank you very much for taking part in this event. Good evening, and in July we'll be announcing the winner of the Green Family History Award. But I just want to say, and I think my fellow judges would agree, this has just been such a wonderful array of books dealing with really important ideas and really showing how history writing in Australia, and particularly in Tasmania, because they're all about Tasmanian history, is alive and well. And thank you all. Good evening.